18 million Americans watched it live, but only a few understood what they were witnessing in real time. Because sometimes truth doesn't enter with thunder. Sometimes it walks in carrying a folder and a burned teddy bear. In just 5 minutes, Jasmine Crockett didn't just expose a man. She exposed a mindset, one built on silence, sealed with policy, and defended in the name of national security. 7 words, one child. A room that had been trained to look the other way was suddenly forced to see. A system that claimed to protect the nation was caught erasing its soul. And all it took was a woman who refused to look away. A little girl had died behind locked doors. A man in power had smiled behind fine print. And when those two stories collided, right there beneath the marble dome of Congress, the room didn't erupt. It held its breath, because something irreversible had just begun. So ask yourself, when the law is used to erase the voiceless, who dares to speak for them? It was 9:02 a.m. when the heavy doors to room 2141 creaked open. Jasmine Crockett entered alone. No cameras flashed. No whispers followed. But something unspoken shifted, like the room had been waiting for her, even if it didn't know it yet. It was exactly 9:02 a.m. when the double doors to room 2141 opened, not with urgency, but with a kind of groaning reluctance, as if even the hinges sensed what was about to happen inside. The hallway outside had been polished to perfection, every marble tile shining like a lie scrubbed too many times. But when Jasmine Crockett stepped across the threshold, heels clicking softly like the second hand of a courtroom clock, the room changed. Not obviously, not loudly, but subtly in the way tension rearranges the air just before a thunderstorm. She wasn't late, but she wasn't early either. She arrived exactly when she meant to, alone. No aides flanking her, no legal team trailing behind. Just her, a tightly held black folder under one arm and a single pen clipped to its edge. The silence she carried wasn't hesitation, it was purpose. The kind of silence that makes you lean in without realizing why. Inside, the hearing chamber was already half full. Reporters adjusted tripods and murmured over camera angles. Congressional aides whispered behind phones. A few lawmakers checked their watches, some tapping notes onto tablets while others made it a point not to notice her entrance. But Jasmine noticed everything. The way her nameplate had been shifted 2 inches to the right, away from the center of the witness table, just enough to suggest she didn't quite belong. The way the central mic cable had been taped down slightly off balance, forcing her chair to lean left unless she adjusted it manually. Small things, petty things, but deliberate. They had underestimated her before. It wasn't new. In fact, she was starting to expect it. But today, they wouldn't just underestimate her. Today, they would regret it. At the far end of the room, facing the gallery like a sculpted gargoyle, sat Stephen Miller, perfectly composed, back straight, tie sharp, hands folded into a practice steeple. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, not long enough to be called a challenge, but long enough to carry a message. I've seen your type before. And Jasmine, without missing a beat, blinked once, slowly. Her message in return, no, you haven't. She didn't rush to her seat. Instead, she paused for a moment at the edge of the table, running her fingers across the cool surface, as if taking inventory of the battlefield. A chair scraped somewhere behind her. Someone coughed. A congressional aide dropped a file, paper scattering with a nervous flutter. And still, she said nothing. The chairman of the Judiciary Subcommittee, Andrew Hollister, cleared his throat. A war veteran turned independent lawmaker, his voice was gravel, his presence steady. Let the hearing come to order, he said, gaze locked on the center. But his eyes flicked, just briefly, toward Jasmine. He knew. He'd read the sealed documents the night before. He knew she wasn't here to make a point. She was here to pull the thread. What no one could know, what not even the cameras would catch at first, was what Jasmine had tucked inside that folder. It wasn't just evidence. It was everything they'd hoped would stay buried. Classified emails, whistleblower testimony, and one burned teddy bear. That bear would speak louder than any statement ever could. But not yet. For now, she sat down. Calm, ready, unmoving. And while the committee shifted papers and rechecked their talking points, Jasmine quietly uncapped her pen and underlined just one line in her notes. 7 words circled twice in dark ink. They weren't for the committee. They weren't even for Stephen Miller. They were for the nation watching. When you choose who gets to live, Stephen Miller didn't need an introduction. Not in that room. Not in this country. His name had lingered in headlines for years, whispered in immigration courts, echoed through border towns, stitched like a shadow beneath executive orders. He wasn't elected. He never needed to be. He had shaped policies from the back room, signed memos that turned fathers into fugitives, and wrote speeches that clothed cruelty in legal language. And now here he was, facing the very system he thought he had mastered. He sat still, but stillness wasn't weakness for him. It was strategy. His posture was rigid, not from nerves but from habit. Shoulders squared, palms down, fingers lightly interlaced. His tie, a deep crimson shade that looked almost intentional, was centered with surgical precision. If power had a pose, Stephen Miller had memorized it. His eyes scanned the room slowly, never darting. He watched like a man surveying blueprints, not a battlefield. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't on his blueprint. He had studied people like her. At least he thought he had. The outspoken woman of color, the disruptor, the idealist, the kind who burns hot and fast but eventually gets buried beneath the weight of bureaucracy. What he hadn't calculated was what happened when someone like Jasmine didn't shout, when she didn't interrupt, when she came not to protest but to prove. That kind of presence wasn't on any flowchart he understood. And that's why, for all his preparation, he looked just slightly off, like a man who had brought armor to a trial where truth was the only weapon. Behind his eyes, you could see the algorithm running. He would frame it all in national security. He would call it survival, not strategy. Order, not oppression. He'd point to legal precedent, not moral consequence. That was his genius, not to deny the pain, but to make the pain sound like policy. And it had worked. For years. Under his direction, the Department of Homeland Security restructured its internal metrics to prioritize speed over appeals. Immigration judges were quietly reassigned. Asylum offices were gutted of translators. One former staffer once said, "It wasn't about who belonged here, it was about how fast we could get them out." And in every memo, Stephen's signature lingered like the cold ink of intention. What haunted the margins of these documents were not typos. They were absences. The absence of children's names, the absence of criminal charges, the absence of due process. In their place, checkboxes, origins, accents, skin tones entered as data points in a machine that didn't blink. And he'd built that machine. Now seated just 30 feet from the woman who'd come to unplug it, Miller looked every bit as composed as his reputation promised. But reputation couldn't hide everything. His fingers, once steepled, occasionally tightened. His right thumb pressed into the side of his hand as if grounding himself. There was tension in his jaw, a small, involuntary flex whenever the word oversight was mentioned. Jasmine noticed. She didn't look at him often. She didn't need to. She could feel his presence the way you feel a storm gathering behind you, but she wasn't here to chase thunder. She was here to reveal the storm's architect. And Miller, for all his stillness, for all his scripts, was not ready for what she had brought. Because this time, the blueprint was hers. The room had been rehearsed for noise, talking points, objections, the mechanical rhythm of political theater. But what no one was prepared for was the absence of it. Jasmine Crockett sat, hands steady on the folder before her, back straight but not stiff, and said absolutely nothing for 10 long seconds. In congressional terms, that was an eternity. Chairs shifted, a throat cleared. Someone adjusted their mic just to fill the void. But she didn't blink. She didn't move. She let the silence do what noise never could, command attention. At first, people thought it was hesitation. Then they realized it was strategy. Every eye in the room slowly turned toward her, unsure if they were about to witness a breakdown or a beginning. But Jasmine knew what she was doing. In a chamber built on sound bites and grandstanding, she had chosen restraint as her scalpel, and it cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. Chairman Hollister leaned slightly forward, watching her with something between curiosity and caution. His fingers hovered over his gavel, unsure if he should prompt her or let the tension play out. Beside him, an aide silently mouthed the words, "Is she okay?" But she wasn't just okay. She was loaded, and the trigger was time. Then with the faintest motion, Jasmine unlatched the folder in front of her. The sound was crisp, paper against metal. She flipped open the first page slowly, deliberately, revealing a header stamped "Confidential." DHS Internal Protocol, Habeas Corpus Suspension, unredacted. Gasps didn't erupt, but they echoed inside every brow that furrowed, every spine that straightened. This wasn't just paperwork, it was evidence, and no one had been briefed that it would surface. Stephen Miller's eyes flicked toward the folder, then quickly back to Jasmine, still composed, still motionless. But behind his expression, there was movement, mental gears recalibrating, defenses sharpening. She hadn't even spoken, yet somehow she had already forced him off script. Jasmine took her time, not out of arrogance, but out of precision. Every second bought her more space. Every pause reminded the room, she is not here to perform, she is here to expose. And just when the silence had become unbearable, she finally leaned toward her mic. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look for camera angles. She just spoke. "When a government uses its laws to cage its conscience," she said softly, "someone has to hold up the mirror." Her tone was calm, her words clear, but they hit like a courtroom slap. Around the gallery, pens stopped scribbling. Reporters looked up. Even the court stenographer missed a keystroke. She continued, "I'm not here to debate theory. I'm here to put names to policy, lives to numbers, grief to memos. And if some of you are uncomfortable, good. That means you're still human." Stephen Miller's hands, still folded, twitched, just slightly. Jasmine closed the folder again, sealing it like a quiet verdict. "I'll begin with Exhibit 1, she said, "but I suggest everyone remember this. Not all pain makes noise. Some of it walks in silence and refuses to leave until it's heard." And with that, she reached into her folder again. This time, for the beginning of the storm. Stephen Miller didn't lean into the microphone immediately. He waited. Let the weight of Jasmine's words settle. Let the silence regain its edge. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, neither defiant nor defensive, but clinical, like a surgeon explaining an incision before the blade touches skin. "National security," he began, "isn't a slogan. It's a responsibility, and it comes with hard decisions." There was no preamble, no courtesy acknowledgement of Jasmine's testimony, just the immediate pivot to control the narrative. He tapped the folder in front of him gently. 3 calculated strikes, like a judge's gavel echoing without permission. "This document," he said, gesturing toward the classified DHS protocol she had revealed, "has been portrayed here today as an assault on liberty. But it is, in fact, the very mechanism that ensures liberty survives. The framing was deliberate. To question the policy," Miller implied, "was to question the survival of the country." He looked directly at the committee, skipping Jasmine altogether now, speaking to the men and women who still sat on the fence. "We are witnessing an unprecedented crisis at our borders. Millions of illegal crossings, organized smuggling rings, individuals with unverifiable backgrounds slipping into American communities. If we allow loopholes, if we continue to treat immigration like an open invitation rather than a matter of sovereignty, we are not protecting our laws. We are eroding them." He paused for effect, not because he needed to breathe, but because he knew the value of timing, of silence that implied control. "Expedited detention," he continued, "is not cruelty. It is efficiency. Limited judicial interference is not tyranny. It is prioritization. And the suspension of habeas corpus in narrowly defined cases involving undocumented entrants with high-risk profiles is not unconstitutional. It is necessary." Words like efficiency, prioritization, and profiles fell like clean stones into still water. They didn't shock. They numbed, and that was the point. He wasn't speaking to the emotions in the room. He was bypassing them entirely. Miller turned slightly toward the media row, knowing the cameras had begun to capture the sound bites. He spoke slowly, with just enough edge to suggest urgency, without tipping into alarmism. If habeas corpus becomes a shield for unlawful presence, then we have turned our own Constitution against itself. We've weaponized rights against the rule of law, and that, he added with a glance now directly at Jasmine, is a greater threat to American integrity than any one policy document. For a moment, the air in the room shifted, not because his argument was compelling, but because it was familiar. The language of law wrapped around fear, the justification of systemic exclusion delivered with chilling calm. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She didn't shake her head or lift her pen, but her eyes, sharp, focused, didn't leave his face. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. She'd heard this script before, just never this close, never this loud. Miller finished with the practiced stillness of someone who believed in what he had just said, or at least had learned to say it well enough to convince others. He sat back in his chair, hands folded, spine straight. Not a hair out of place, but something was out of place. Everyone could feel it, because even as his voice faded into the official record, another sound had taken root in the room. A quiet, creeping question. If survival demands we erase due process, what part of us survives? Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She let Stephen Miller's words hang in the air, cold, methodical, the kind that sound reasonable until they're forced to wear a face. When she finally reached for the small black remote beside her folder, she didn't speak. She simply pressed one button. The lights in the room dimmed by a fraction. The screen behind her blinked to life, and with it, so did the truth. The footage began without introduction. Grainy black and white, time-stamped in the lower right corner. El Paso, Texas, August 14th, 2022, 2:47 a.m. The angle was from a stationary security camera perched across the street, pointed toward a modest home with a sagging porch and peeling paint. Then came movement, 3 unmarked SUVs sliding to a stop. Men in tactical gear poured out. No lights, no sirens. Just quiet force. There was no warning, no knock. The door was breached within seconds. Inside, the camera couldn't follow. But what it could see, what everyone in the hearing room now saw, was a barefoot man, handcuffed, being dragged out moments later. His name appeared in the lower caption, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. No criminal record. Behind him, a woman stood in the doorway, holding 2 children, one on each hip, her mouth moving in frantic disbelief. One of the little girls reached out as her father disappeared into the darkness. No warrant was presented. No words were exchanged. Only a single line displayed on an agent's tablet. Flagged, MS-13 Association. Unverified. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. The video did the talking. The footage cut to inside an ICE holding facility. Harsh fluorescent lights. Rows of steel cots. Kilmar sat alone, unmoving, while an officer read aloud from a clipboard in English. No translator. No explanation. He nodded slowly, clearly not understanding. Then came the final frame. A visitation window, smudged with fingerprints. On one side, Kilmar. On the other, his daughter, 8 years old, her tiny palms pressed flat against the glass. Her lips moved, forming silent words no one could hear. The screen went black. The silence that followed was not procedural. It was personal. Something in the room had changed. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice low but unwavering. He never had a parking ticket, she said. He worked 2 jobs. He paid taxes. He never once raised his voice in public. But someone clicked a box, and that was all it took. She paused just long enough for the weight to settle. His only crime was the color of his skin and the place where he was born. A rustle passed through the gallery. Not outrage, recognition. This wasn't a clip from another country. This wasn't history. This was now. And the girl with her palms on the glass wasn't a symbol. She was a child, a daughter, someone's everything. Stephen Miller didn't move, but the edge of his thumb tapped once, involuntarily, against the table. Jasmine continued. This is not about crisis. This is not about profiles. This is about what happens when suspicion becomes policy, when accusation becomes process, when a line of code becomes a sentence without trial. She glanced toward the committee. This footage was not leaked. It was buried. And then she looked directly at Miller. Calm, focused, without hate, but without hesitation. You buried it. Jasmine let the silence stretch for another beat after the screen faded to black. She didn't rush to fill it. She knew better. Some silences don't need rescue. They need space to settle, to stain. And in that moment, every person in that room was sitting with something they didn't expect to feel in a congressional hearing. Guilt. Then without ceremony, Jasmine reached back into her folder and pulled out a slim stack of paper, cleanly printed, stapled at the top, marked with 4 words in bold type. October 2015. Internal email chain. She stepped away from the mic and placed the pages on the elevated committee table as if she were laying out something fragile, something radioactive. These, she said quietly, are verified communications from 2015, obtained through FOIA litigation, cross-checked by oversight staff, and authenticated by former agency personnel. Her tone was surgical, precise. Each of these emails was sent or forwarded by Mr. Stephen Miller during his tenure as a senior policy advisor, and each includes references to publications flagged by the SPLC as white nationalist media. No gasps, just stillness. She opened to one email in particular, flipped to a highlighted paragraph, and read aloud. Her voice was steady, but it cut like winter air. We need to focus on building a population that matches American DNA. The sentence fell into the chamber like a dropped stone. No commentary, no dramatic flourish, just the words themselves, echoing into the congressional record. Jasmine looked up, scanning the room, not at Miller, but at the committee, the gallery, the press. I will not explain what that means, she said, because everyone here already knows. She placed the page face up on the table. Her fingers held it flat against the wood, as if anchoring it so no one could look away. Then softly, this wasn't written in a fringe form. It wasn't overheard at a rally. This was in a government inbox, in the hands of a man shaping national policy. Stephen Miller didn't flinch, but a muscle jumped once at the corner of his jaw. His gaze drifted toward the email, then snapped back to Jasmine, expression unreadable, but just barely. Jasmine didn't return the look. She turned instead to the rest of the committee. We're not just talking about fast-track deportations or expedited removals. We're talking about ideology, about the quiet clinical language used to give bigotry a badge. She pointed toward the screen that had just shown Kilmar's daughter. When a child presses her hands against bulletproof glass to reach her father, it doesn't matter how many legal memos you have. It matters what made you believe she didn't belong. Then her voice lowered, almost to a whisper. This is not about protecting the border. It's about protecting a myth, one that says only certain people deserve to call this country home. The silence that followed wasn't defensive. It wasn't confused. It was the silence of recognition, of something ugly that had finally been named. And for the first time that morning, Stephen Miller didn't look untouchable. He looked cornered. Stephen Miller sat a little straighter. Not much, just enough to reassert posture, to suggest he still owned the floor. He had been cornered before, in headlines, in op-eds, in interviews. But this was different. This was federal record. This was a hearing room where truth didn't need ratings. It needed evidence. And Jasmine had plenty. So he did what people like him are trained to do when morality slips. He pivoted back to the law. The Constitution, he began, voice sharpened to sound composed, provides allowances in times of rebellion or invasion. He spoke slowly, emphasizing every syllable, as if drawing strength from the text itself. Article 1, Section 9, the very foundation of congressional authority, clearly permits the suspension of habeas corpus in extraordinary circumstances. He looked around the room, scanning faces not for understanding, but for alignment. We are in one of those circumstances now, not by choice, but by necessity. Our borders have been overwhelmed, our resources stretched, and inaction is no longer an option. He paused for effect. Everything I have proposed, everything that's been implemented under this framework, falls within the limits of constitutional authority granted under emergency conditions. That is not up for interpretation. That is settled law. To the untrained ear, it sounded reasonable. It always did, because Stephen Miller didn't use the Constitution as a shield. He used it as a scalpel, cutting away context, carving out fear, wrapping cruelty in legal precedent. His tone never rose, but the danger wasn't in volume. It was in conviction. Jasmine waited until he was done, not a second longer. Then she leaned forward, placed both palms on the table, and spoke, not with emotion, but with clarity so exact it felt like a blade. Article 1, Section 9, she said, does indeed permit the suspension of habeas corpus, but only under two conditions: rebellion or invasion. Not poverty, not language, not geography, rebellion or invasion. She let the words sink in. Her voice remained calm, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. What you're describing is not an invasion, it's desperation. It's families fleeing violence, poverty, and persecution, seeking asylum under laws this country helped write. Then she picked up a printed copy of the Constitution and opened it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for Scripture. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, she read, unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. She looked straight at him now. Tell me, Mr. Miller, which of those two do barefoot children crossing deserts fall under? Rebellion or invasion? He didn't respond, didn't blink, but his jaw tightened. Jasmine continued, this is not legal argument. This is legal theater. And your performance is based on the hope that no one in this room or this country remembers the difference between authority and abuse. She placed the document down gently, then added, when law becomes language used to erase due process, what we're left with is not governance. It's a machine, and machines do not grieve. The room was utterly still, not because her voice was loud, but because it made something undeniable rise to the surface. The collapse wasn't legal, it was moral, and Jasmine had just made everyone watch it happen in real time. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice. She only needed to raise the page. And so she did, lifting a printout from the Department of Homeland Security audit, her fingers careful not to crease the edge. She didn't announce it with drama. She didn't point or jab. She simply held it where the cameras could see. And then she read. Between January and June of this year, she said calmly, 7,412 white South African applicants were granted expedited entry into the United States under a specialized refugee designation citing racial persecution. She let that number linger. During that exact same time frame, the number of Haitian and Syrian applicants approved under the same protocol dropped by 63%. She placed the sheet on the table and looked up, not at Stephen Miller, but at the room. Same form, same process, same federal desks. Her voice didn't shake. Different results. A low rustle passed through the chamber, pages flipping, pens pausing, the kind of movement that happens when discomfort tries to rearrange itself into justification. But there was no rearranging this. The numbers were too clean, too sharp. She flipped to the next page, highlighting a bar chart with red markers that practically screamed from the paper. When asked to explain the discrepancy, DHS representatives cited variability in regional assessments and limited processing bandwidth. Yet internal logs from the same offices show 98% of white applicants received processing within 15 days, while more than half of black applicants were delayed past 60. She looked directly at the committee now, eyes unwavering. These are not rounding errors. These are design flaws, written by choice, protected by policy, and ignored by people who didn't think anyone would ever line up the math. Stephen Miller shifted for the first time since the last exchange. A slight lean back, fingers interlacing tightly again, the color around his knuckles paling. He didn't speak, and Jasmine didn't give him the chance. You can claim urgency, you can claim national risk, you can cite legal precedent, but what you cannot explain, what you cannot rationalize, is how urgency seems to always serve those who look like you and delay those who do not. She lifted a final page, this one marked with a heat map. This is a visual breakdown of expedited removals by race across 6 regions. Red indicates over-indexing. And as you can see, she turned the map to face the room, the red doesn't follow crime rates. It doesn't follow terrorism risks. It follows skin color. She didn't shout. She didn't dramatize. But the weight of her words did not need help. They carried their own gravity. I'm not asking you to feel bad for numbers, she continued. I'm asking you to recognize that behind every percentage point, there is a father, a daughter, a grandmother with a Bible in her hands at a port of entry. Her voice softened, not with pity, but with finality. We're not looking at a mistake. We're looking at a pattern. No one moved, not the chairman, not the press, not even the stenographer, because Jasmine hadn't just shown them a gap. She had shown them a system that bled the same people again and again, and called it policy. And the numbers, brutal in their honesty, were no longer abstract. They were now testimony. For a moment, Jasmine said nothing. The charts had been shown, the maps had been turned, the numbers had spoken their quiet, brutal truth. But now it wasn't data that filled the room. It was expectation, the kind that presses into the back of your neck when you know someone's about to say something that can't be unsaid. She lifted her eyes not with fire, but with something colder, clarity, and then she asked the question. If this isn't a race-based policy, she said slowly, her voice almost too quiet for the mic, then what exactly do you call it? The words didn't echo. They landed, like a door slamming shut in a quiet hallway. No one responded, not Miller, not the committee, not the gallery, because they all knew what it was. They just didn't want to be the one to say it out loud. She didn't elaborate. She didn't fill the silence. That was the brilliance of it. She didn't accuse. She exposed. She didn't shame. She unveiled. And the discomfort that followed wasn't outrage. It was realization. The kind that makes people shift in their chairs, look down at their notepads, and wonder how long they've been sitting in the wrong story. A congressman at the far end of the dais adjusted his cufflinks twice. Another flipped through a binder that had nothing relevant to the moment. Jasmine saw all of it. She'd been in rooms like this before. She'd watched power retreat behind process. But this time, there was no memo to hide behind. No talking point to smooth the edges. Just the weight of a simple question and the inability to answer it without indicting the very system they were sworn to protect. Stephen Miller opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak, then closed it. His eyes dropped to the documents Jasmine had laid bare in front of him. For once, his vocabulary, the arsenal of precision he'd so carefully constructed over years, failed to launch. There was no term strong enough to spin those numbers, no clause clever enough to erase that map. His silence was louder than any rebuttal he could have given. Jasmine didn't press him. She didn't need to. She let the question live in the room. Let it breathe. Let it haunt. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, because if we don't call this what it is, then we are complicit in what it becomes. That line hit different, not because it was angry, but because it was true. From the gallery, someone shifted uncomfortably. A legal aide behind the committee chair glanced at his colleague and quietly slid his phone screen down. A still frame from the earlier video, Kilmar's daughter pressing her hands against the glass, remained on the lock screen, frozen, unblinking. Jasmine sat back in her chair, not triumphant, not smug, just certain. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in a courtroom isn't a lie. It's the moment everyone hears the truth and realizes they can never pretend they didn't. Jasmine didn't reach for another document. She didn't queue up another video or pull a fresh chart from her folder. Instead, she leaned slightly to her right and unzipped a slim cloth case resting on the floor beside her chair. The sound of the zipper was soft, but in that chamber of marble and tension, it might as well have been thunder. She brought something out with both hands, gently, reverently. Not as a politician presenting evidence, but as a mother holding something sacred. It was small, ragged, burned on one side, a faded, half-melted teddy bear, one eye missing, stitching torn loose along the bottom seam. But it wasn't the damage that made the room still. It was the familiarity. Every person in that room had seen a toy like it once, on a bed, in a stroller, clutched tight by tiny fingers. Jasmine held it for a moment, close to her chest. Then she laid it softly on the table in front of her, its charred ear facing the committee like a silent witness. She looked down at it for a long second, as if drawing strength, then spoke. Her name, she said, voice steady but thick with something unsaid, was Mariana. The name settled like dust on old wood. No one moved, not even the stenographer. She was 7 years old. Her mother carried her across the southern border near Eagle Pass in the summer of 2021. They were fleeing cartel violence, seeking asylum, seeking safety. They didn't bring much, just a Bible, some papers, and this bear. She touched the fabric gently with one finger, as if afraid it might vanish. They were placed in detention. The lights never turned off. The air was too cold. And within 3 days, Mariana developed a fever. Her mother begged for a doctor. None came. She asked again. Still none. By the time a nurse was alerted, Mariana's lips were blue. Jasmine paused, not for effect, but for breath. She died 48 hours later, alone, in a locked room, under fluorescent lights, no window, no prayers, no voice to hold her hand. A quiet exhale escaped from somewhere in the gallery, the sound of someone remembering how to breathe. This bear, Jasmine said, lifting it an inch off the table, was given to me by Mariana's mother. After the funeral, after the system handed her a death certificate and said there would be no investigation, after someone signed a form that said it was nobody's fault, she set the bear back down. I bring it here not as a prop, not as a plea, but as proof. Her eyes now locked on the committee and then, deliberately, on Stephen Miller. You designed the policy, the one that stripped medical review from detention centers, the one that flagged low-risk detainees as non-priority, the one that allowed a 7-year-old girl to die in a room where help was 10 minutes away, but never came. She didn't yell. She didn't blink. This isn't politics. This isn't process. This is the last thing left of a child who trusted us to be human. No one spoke, not because they didn't want to, but because for the first time that morning, they understood they didn't deserve to. The bear didn't move. It didn't cry. It didn't speak. But in that moment, it said more than anyone in the room ever could. It said what graphs couldn't capture, what memos refused to admit. It said, this happened, and no amount of policy language could explain it away. Jasmine didn't reach for another document. She didn't list more names. She just looked at the bear, like it might still carry the warmth of the child who once held it through the night. The kind of warmth that no detention center could replicate. The kind of warmth that dies quietly when systems choose rules over empathy. She looked back up. Her voice, when it returned, had changed. Not louder, not weaker, but heavier, like it had passed through something deeper before rising again. This, she said, gesturing softly toward the bear, is what's left when compassion dies. Not just the toy, not just the ashes, but the silence that follows. The hollow explanations, the reports that say, no wrongdoing found. The bureaucratic brushstrokes we use to paint over the absence of accountability. She turned to the committee now, eyes scanning each of them, not to accuse, but to ask something more dangerous, to remember. There were at least 6 documented requests for medical attention filed by Mariana's mother. 6. Each one logged, each one ignored. Not because someone was evil, but because someone was indifferent. Because someone, somewhere believed that urgency wasn't owed to people like her. No one spoke. Some shifted. One congressman scribbled something that looked more like a distraction than a note. Jasmine saw it. She let it pass. Compassion, she said, is not a luxury in governance. It is not a suggestion, it is a requirement. Or else what we're left with is process without soul, laws without humanity, rooms like this one, filled with titles and microphones, pretending not to hear the quiet scream of what we've allowed. She paused just long enough to let the silence return, and then she leaned in, her voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. You know what makes this bear dangerous? She asked. It's not that it's burned. It's not that it belonged to a child who died under your policy. It's that it made it here. It crossed every wall meant to keep it invisible, every excuse, every delay, and now it sits here, watching you. The bear, scorched and sagging, lay limp on the table. But its presence had grown. It had become a weight none of them could shift. Stephen Miller hadn't spoken since it appeared. His hands were no longer folded. They gripped the edge of the table, white-knuckled, not in defiance, but in suspension, as if letting go might signal weakness, or worse, admission. Jasmine didn't look at him directly. She didn't need to. She spoke now to the room, to the nation, to every quiet hallway where grief had been archived as collateral damage. If we allow our systems to define worth by birthplace, if we teach our staff that time matters less when skin is darker, if we build policies that treat pain as noise to be filtered, then we are not protecting America. We are burying it. She sat back slowly, her eyes not triumphant, but tired, not defeated, but finished. And the bear remained. It started with a twitch, barely perceptible, a flicker in the corner of Stephen Miller's cheek, a pulse that betrayed everything his mouth still refused to say. Jasmine Crockett had not accused him of murder. She had not shouted. She had not weaponized her voice. Instead, she had placed a burned teddy bear on the table, whispered the name Mariana, and let the silence devour what remained of his composure. And now the man who had architected deportation pipelines with surgical precision was sitting 3 feet from a relic of what those policies had cost. It wasn't the data that cracked him. It was the unbearable truth that the room, the system he once commanded, was no longer bending to his logic. Stephen Miller straightened in his seat, jaw clenched, trying to summon the voice he'd used for years to mask intent with legality. But this time, when he opened his mouth, the sound that came out wasn't smooth. It was sharp, angry, desperate. "This is character assassination," he snapped, each syllable trembling beneath a surface that had finally shattered. His voice wasn't calm and chilling now. It was acidic, uneven. Congresswoman Crockett isn't here to discuss law. She's here to stage a political stunt, a racial theater. The words rang out with the force of a gavel, but no one leaned forward to listen. No one nodded. They only watched. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Her silence was a wall he couldn't scale, a mirror he couldn't escape, and that drove him further. "You are weaponizing personal tragedy to stoke hatred toward white Americans," he hissed, pointing one finger toward the bear on the table, not quite touching it, as if proximity alone might burn him. "This hearing has turned into a trial by emotion, not evidence." He looked around the room, searching for affirmation, for allies, anyone who would validate the venom he was now bleeding onto the floor. But the room was still, cold, watching. The more he spoke, the more he collapsed. "If anyone else said what she just did," he barked, "if they accused policy writers of racism just for doing their jobs, this room would erupt." His voice cracked, just once, but it was enough. It wasn't authority anymore. It was panic. "But because she directs it at people like me, it's considered righteous?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It was flailing. It was a man grasping at the last threads of control, unraveling in real time under the weight of his own legacy. He turned back to Jasmine, eyes narrowed, not in intellectual disagreement, but in fury. "This isn't oversight. It's a political lynching dressed up as justice." The words dropped like a bomb. Audible gasps broke out. Even behind him, one of his aides shifted uncomfortably, and a Republican lawmaker's head dropped into their hands. But Jasmine? She remained still, impossibly still. Because when a man shows you who he is, you don't need to speak over him. You let the room hear his echo loud and unfiltered. And they did. The silence that followed wasn't fragile. It was judgment. Not from one woman, but from everyone who had finally seen behind the curtain. The polished speechwriter, the legal tactician, the man who had spoken for power. Now reduced to a shaking voice and an unraveling defense. No one had interrupted him. No one had accused him. They had simply handed him the mirror and watched as he broke himself inside it. Jasmine leaned forward, not to counter, but to close. Her voice was soft, but deadly accurate. "Hatred," she said, is what you planted. I'm just here cleaning up the wreckage. Her words weren't sharp. They were final. The kind of line that doesn't require applause to land. The kind of truth that cuts through air like a scalpel through scar tissue. She reached for a single sheet of paper and laid it gently atop the others. No dramatics, no performance. It was an internal audit, stamped, dated, signed. This document shows that 73% of individuals denied their right to appeal under your expedited removal program were Black or Latino, she said, calmly tapping the corner. Not because of risk, not because of threat, but because of who they were. She didn't look at him. She looked at the room. If that's not systemic, then what is? Miller said nothing. His hands were no longer folded, no longer steepled. They were gripping the arms of his chair now, not to hold power, but to hold on to the edge of something that was slipping away. His legacy, his veneer, his last defense. Because this wasn't a debate anymore, it was a reckoning. And the man who once moved in shadows had been dragged into the light and left there blinking, breathless, undone. The air in the hearing room had thickened to something no one could name. Not silence, not tension, something else. Like the moment before a thunderclap, when the world holds its breath without realizing it. Stephen Miller sat frozen in the shadow of his own unraveling, the remnants of his voice still echoing faintly off the marble walls. The teddy bear still lay in front of Jasmine, scorched and unmovable, like a relic from a battlefield no one had wanted to acknowledge. The pages she had placed, statistics, testimony, timelines, were no longer just paper. They had become indictment. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She didn't gloat. She didn't pause to let the room settle. She leaned in, slightly like someone sharing a final secret, and let her voice carry the calm precision of a scalpel about to cut history open. America, she said, doesn't need a DNA filter to define the right to live. The words dropped like a detonator, not loud, but irreversible. For a second, no one moved. No one even blinked. It wasn't a soundbite. It was a wound. A statement so clean, so devastating, that it sliced through every rationalization in the room like it was paper. A congressman coughed and then immediately regretted it. Reporters' pens hovered above their notepads as if afraid to distort what had just been said. One aide gasped quietly, hand halfway to their mouth. And Stephen Miller? He didn't blink, didn't twitch. He just stared at Jasmine like he'd heard a prophecy. One that spelled the end of the world he built, word by word, policy by policy. Outside the hearing room, phones buzzed in wave after wave. The live feed, barely 10 seconds behind, captured her statement in full clarity and sent it pulsing across the country like an electric shock through a frayed wire. On TikTok, teenagers clipped the sentence and stitched it over images of detention centers and playgrounds. On cable news, anchors interrupted scheduled programming. On Twitter, hashtags erupted, DNA does not decide, CROCKETTRUTH, POWERTOPROTECT. But inside room 2141, there was no applause, no chaos, just the stillness of something sacred being said out loud for the first time, and the collective realization that it could never be unsaid. Jasmine didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. That one sentence had said everything. It spoke for the children with no lawyers, the mothers with no translators, the fathers flagged by faulty software and deleted by silence. It spoke for the families denied due process, for the names buried in reports marked confidential, for every burned bear that would never make it to a congressional table. She had taken their erasure and made it visible. And the room, once a fortress of protocols and rehearsed detachment, had become a courtroom of conscience, with no exit. Stephen Miller's fingers tapped once, just once, against the table before him. It was a reflex, not a rebuttal. His mind was searching for footing, for language that could contain what had just been unleashed. But there was no memo that could reframe it, no statute that could soften it. Jasmine had drawn a line through the center of his doctrine, and across it, in permanent ink, she had written the words, "Some truths do not need your permission to exist." And so the room remained still. The bear remained still. Jasmine remained still. But America had already started to move. It didn't take long. The clip of Jasmine's sentence, "America doesn't need a DNA filter to define the right to live," was still circling the globe when a second shockwave hit. This time it didn't come from inside the hearing room. It came from a car. Parked, quiet, camera shaking, voice trembling. But the words were clear. "We were told to flag names by origin, not by evidence." The man on screen wore no badge, no title. Just a Department of Homeland Security ID, partially obscured, enough to prove he was real, but not enough to make him disappear. His voice cracked. His eyes darted between the camera and the windshield. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in weeks, like someone who had finally run out of places to hide. "We were ordered to bypass appeals, to close cases even when they didn't meet criteria. They told us to prioritize South African claims, white Afrikaners. They told us it was to balance the global optics. But we knew what it was. We knew exactly what it was." His hands shook as he held up a tablet screen with rows of case IDs, all labeled with the same tag. Expedited removal. No translator provided. Jasmine's voice could be heard faintly in the background of the car, playing through the radio. The bear, the sentence, the moment. "I kept quiet," he said, "until today, because I needed to know someone would listen." By the time the video was posted, it had already been sent to multiple newsrooms. It spread across platforms like a siren no one could shut off. Within minutes, the DOJ's Office for Civil Rights had issued a statement. "The department has received new evidence relevant to its ongoing review of expedited immigration protocols. We are initiating formal investigative procedures." The sentence was dry, clinical, but the meaning underneath was fire. The government was moving. And this time, it wasn't to protect itself. It was to look inward. Inside room 2141, Jasmine had just returned to her seat when a staffer leaned into Chairman Hollister's ear, whispering in a voice laced with disbelief. He glanced down at his phone, then passed it to his chief counsel. Jasmine saw the shift. She didn't need to ask. The ripple had begun, and it hadn't come from politics. It had come from a man in a car who'd chosen the exact moment the country was finally ready to hear him. Stephen Miller's posture changed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was visible. The steepled hands separated. His shoulders slumped forward, just slightly. Not the slump of defeat, but of recognition. He had built a system that was supposed to be impenetrable. Layers of legalese, gates of executive privilege, corridors too dark to follow. But one man, one confession, had just cracked the code. And with it, everything that had been hidden was now traceable, provable, real. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply looked down at the bear again. And this time, she wasn't the only one looking. From the gallery to the press box to the lawmakers seated across from her, heads turned, because the bear was no longer just evidence. It was now a witness. And so was the man who had once stayed silent. By the end of the day, the footage from room 2141 was no longer just news. It was history unfolding in real time. The bear, the emails, the voice of a whistleblower shaking from the front seat of a parked car. It had all coalesced into something undeniable. For years, the policies had been defended as legal, necessary, pragmatic. But now the country had a face to the consequences, a voice to the silence, and a burn mark they couldn't forget. It wasn't just what Jasmine Crockett had said. It was what she had made them see, what they couldn't unsee. There was Mariana's name, whispered like prayer and indictment. There was the sentence, "America doesn't need a DNA filter to define the right to live," replayed on every screen from news anchors to teachers projecting it onto classroom walls. There was the whistleblower's hand, trembling as he scrolled through case files tagged with origin-based flags, his voice cracking as he confessed, "We were told to move faster if they looked like us." It was all out now, ugly, irreparable, and captured forever in a chamber that once thrived on decorum and denial. In Washington, political aides scrambled behind closed doors, trying to draft statements that didn't sound complicit or cowardly. In state houses, immigration advocates held emergency meetings, coordinating calls for federal oversight. And across the country, ordinary people, retirees, students, parents, stopped scrolling, stopped walking, stopped looking away. For the first time in a long time, a hearing had broken through the wall of apathy. Not with spectacle, but with truth. Jasmine hadn't performed, she hadn't pounded the table. She had simply refused to let them pretend. The teddy bear had done more damage than a dozen subpoenas. The numbers had made the arguments collapse in on themselves. The whistleblower had punctured the last defense. We didn't know. Stephen Miller no longer looked like a strategist. He looked like a defendant in waiting. His name trended globally. Miller collapsed. The system broke. Jasmine spoke. No spin could contain what had been exposed, because this wasn't just about immigration anymore. It was about how a system decides who gets heard, who gets helped, and who gets erased without a trace. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just confronted a man. She had dragged a machine into daylight, and now everyone had seen it, and no one could look away anymore. The walls of room 2141 had never felt so heavy, not when past hearings dragged through 12 hours of legal jargon, not even when classified memos were slipped under doors before sunrise. But now there was something else in the air. Weight, consequence, a pressure that wasn't from politics but from truth. And it settled on every shoulder in the room the moment Chairman Hollister adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and leaned toward the microphone with the quiet solemnity of a man about to change something larger than himself. This committee, he began, voice measured but firm, has received testimony, reviewed classified documentation, and viewed evidence that suggests not just a failure of procedure, but a systemic breach of constitutional protection. No one stirred. No one scribbled. Even the court reporter paused, waiting to catch the next line exactly. Therefore, he continued, pursuant to our oversight authority, I am calling for a motion to vote. Shall this committee formally refer all findings and evidence from today's proceedings to the Department of Justice for full federal investigation into Mr. Stephen Miller's role in the alleged denial of due process and violations of civil and human rights? The silence that followed was suffocating, not because people disagreed, but because the gravity of what had just been said finally crystallized. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist, it was a door opening, one that could lead directly into indictment, into accountability, into history. One by one, members of the committee straightened in their seats. A name was called. A voice responded. Yes. Another. Yes. Then a pause. No. The pattern resumed. Yes. Yes. And another. Each response echoed like the slow rise of a drum beat, steady and irreversible. One of the more conservative members sat with their pen tapping against the desk, eyes darting toward Miller, then back toward the public gallery, where the whistleblower sat, arms folded, eyes unwavering. The member inhaled, exhaled, then said, yes. A ripple moved through the room. Not applause, not gasps, just the sound of posture shifting, of defenses lowering, of inevitability arriving. Chairman Hollister looked up as the final vote was called. By a vote of 10-3, he said, this committee refers all relevant testimony, digital communications, and official documentation to the Department of Justice for formal investigation. There was no gavel slam, no triumphant declaration, just a slow nod, as if to say, it begins now. Stephen Miller didn't stand. He didn't speak. His fingers gripped the sides of his chair so tightly the skin around his knuckles had gone bloodless. His once practiced calm had vanished, replaced by something fragile, something fully human in the most uncomfortable sense. Fear. Jasmine Crockett remained still. Her hands gently closed the folder in front of her, not to retreat, but to mark the moment. She didn't smirk. She didn't blink. She simply pressed her palm once more against the scorched bear beside her, and then stood, not as a victor, but as a witness. Because this wasn't about celebration, it was about responsibility. And as she turned to leave the room, the hallway beyond was no longer quiet. Phones buzzed, reporters swarmed. The storm had broken. And this vote, the one no one thought would happen, was now the vote heard round the Capitol. It started as a tremor, quiet, almost invisible, The kind of shift that doesn't make headlines at first. But beneath the surface of Capitol Hill, something had fractured. Not just Stephen Miller's defense, not just the framework of silence that had protected systemic abuse, but the illusion that justice belonged to any one side. Jasmine Crockett hadn't delivered a partisan takedown. She hadn't laced her voice with party slogans or framed her evidence to fit a platform. She had done something far more dangerous. She had told the truth, plainly, powerfully, without asking permission. And truth, when spoken without fear, doesn't stay confined to party lines. It spills into the streets, into conversations, into votes. In the hours after the hearing, something strange began to happen. Lawmakers who had previously distanced themselves from immigration reform, quiet moderates, old guard conservatives, even a few hardliners, began issuing statements. Not all were endorsements. Some were cautious, measured. But they all had one thing in common. They weren't dismissals. Senator Rickett from Georgia, a man whose career had been built on hardline border rhetoric, tweeted, "While I disagree with Reverend Crockett's conclusions, the evidence presented today deserves serious legal review." Congressman Delgado, a centrist Democrat often accused of playing too safe, posted, "This isn't a party issue. This is a human one." And then came the moment no one had predicted. Congresswoman Sheila Holt, a Republican from Tennessee, known for sparring with Jasmine during budget hearings, walked onto a morning show set the next day and said just one sentence. "I never thought I'd say this, but she was right." The hosts paused. One leaned forward as if he hadn't heard correctly. Holt nodded, face stern. "We watched a child die under a policy we let happen. That's not a blue issue or a red one. That's a line in the dirt, and we crossed it." By noon, journalists were calling it the Holt break. By evening, clips of Holt's statement were playing side by side with Jasmine's bare testimony on every major news network. But this wasn't a media cycle. It was a reckoning. Grassroots organizations on both sides of the aisle began co-signing open letters to the DOJ demanding urgency in the investigation. Local mayors called press conferences not to posture, but to admit, "We didn't push back hard enough," said one in El Paso, "but we will now." Even veteran ICE officers, off the record, began contacting attorneys about potential immunity if they came forward. Inside Jasmine's office, the phone rang nonstop, not just from journalists, from families, from whistleblowers, from former officials who had buried their doubts under layers of loyalty but were now ready to talk. "We always thought it had to be someone on the inside," one said. "We didn't expect it to be someone willing to burn the whole script." And through it all, Jasmine didn't claim a side. She didn't gloat about the vote. She didn't wear the victory like a campaign badge. She walked the same marble halls as always, folder in hand, heels steady, eyes clear. Because for her, this was never about winning an argument. It was about making justice move. And now it was moving. Through chambers, through crowds, through party lines. Because truth, when finally seen, becomes contagious. And justice, when awakened, wears no party badge. In the days that followed the vote, something subtle but irreversible began to take hold. Not in headlines or committee reports, but in the people who had watched it all unfold. Jasmine Crockett's name was still trending. Her sentence still echoed on radio shows and courtroom steps. But she had stepped away from the cameras, not to retreat, to remind everyone this wasn't about her. It never had been. While pundits debated who won the hearing, she was back at her desk, writing, drafting, meeting with civil rights attorneys, sitting quietly with grieving mothers whose children would never return home. The spotlight was never the goal. The work was. But for the rest of the country, for the staffers who used to think these hearings were just procedural theater, for the students who had stayed up all night rewatching her testimony on loop, there was a new, unshakable awareness. Something had been broken open, and it couldn't be closed again. Congressional interns whispered her name like a warning and a prayer. State legislators began referencing the Crockett hearing as a case study in how to speak truth without screaming. In classrooms, teachers dimmed the lights and played her voice not as spectacle, but as curriculum. And on desks across the nation, in coffee shops, in legal offices, in public libraries, there were printouts of the sentence that refused to die. America doesn't need a DNA filter to define the right to live. It wasn't that Jasmine had said something new. It was that she had said it where no one could ignore it. And now, even those who had sat silently during the hearing, those who had once hesitated to speak, were finding their voices. Some were aides who had once helped draft the very policies now under federal investigation. Some were former ICE contractors. Some were parents. Some were just people who had watched Mariana's bare rest on that table and realized for the first time that they had been looking away for far too long. They didn't rise in protest. They rose in purpose. They began sending statements to oversight offices. They formed quiet legal coalitions. They wrote to their representatives not in rage, but in resolve. Not to ask what came next, but to say, "We're ready," because Jasmine had shown them what courage looked like when it refused to turn into performance. And that kind of courage doesn't need applause. It needs to be carried. And so they did. Because justice doesn't move when one person speaks. It moves when the rest of us whisper, "We owe her this." In the echo that followed the vote, the Capitol was no longer humming with routine. It was humming with reckoning. Jasmine Crockett didn't linger in the rotunda. She didn't wait for a line of cameras or a scripted press release. Instead, she stepped quietly through the stone corridors. Folder in one hand, the bear in the other, her heels clicking softly against the floor, as though marking the rhythm of something bigger than her. This wasn't victory. This wasn't closure. It was the beginning of the long, slow unwinding of a system that had forgotten what its power was meant to serve. The DOJ had already begun issuing subpoenas. Civil rights attorneys had opened files they never thought would see sunlight. The whistleblower who had once spoken from the shadows was now preparing to testify under oath. But Jasmine remained distant from the spectacle. She let others take the podium. She had delivered her truth. Now it was time for the institutions built on avoidance to face their own silence. For years, policies had been passed in the name of national security. For years, fear had been framed as patriotism. For years, procedure had been treated as morality. But the truth had been simpler all along. Power was never meant to suppress. It was meant to protect. In closed-door rooms, leaders who once dismissed her as a performance artist now used her language in internal memos. "We must re-examine removal protocol," one staffer wrote. "We must build with Crockett standards," said another. Some did it to save face. Others quietly because they had been moved. Because something in the stillness of that hearing room, something in the way she never raised her voice and yet made the nation lean in, had reminded them what power was supposed to feel like. Not fear, not force, but responsibility. Meanwhile, in places far from Washington, county courts, school boards, immigration nonprofits, her impact rippled quietly. A group of teenagers in Detroit organized a teach-in. A retired judge in Arizona came out of private life to lead a pro bono review of detention appeals. A mother in New Mexico taped Jasmine's words to the inside of her front door. "Power is not a weapon. It is a vow." These weren't headlines, but they were evidence. Evidence that the story had moved past the building where it began and taken root in the people it was meant to protect. Jasmine didn't need to explain the philosophy behind her work. She had lived it. She had made them see it. And as the halls of Congress buzzed with the next legislative crisis, as networks scrambled to cover the legal firestorm now encircling Stephen Miller, there was one truth that no spin could dilute. The people had seen what justice was supposed to look like, and it didn't scream. It didn't threaten. It didn't suppress. It stood calmly in the center of a storm and said, "Not today." And now no one could pretend they didn't know better. Because once power is redefined, it can't be unseen. And once a nation is reminded of its conscience, it doesn't go quiet again. Justice didn't look like a gavel this time. It didn't look like a shouting match on the Senate floor or a headline crafted for outrage. It looked like a small, burned teddy bear sitting in a glass display case inside the Smithsonian's new exhibit on modern civil rights. It looked like a folded copy of Jasmine Crockett's hearing transcript, open to the line that cracked the nation open. America doesn't need a DNA filter to define the right to live. It looked like teachers assigning the hearing as part of government curriculum, like high school seniors quoting her in valedictorian speeches, like murals in cities that had never heard her name before, suddenly showing her not holding a mic, but standing with a child who never made it home. Justice looked like acknowledgement, like a system, once hollow, beginning to fill in its missing pieces with memory, responsibility, and humanity. And in quieter places, it looked like movement. It looked like a father in Houston finally being granted an appeal hearing after 2 years of silence. Like a new ICE directive banning the use of racial profiling as an admissible framework. Like a judge in El Paso quoting Mariana's story before ruling in favor of a detained asylum seeker. These weren't grand gestures. They were course corrections, small, precise, and powerful. Because Jasmine hadn't just shown America the cost of its indifference. She had shown it the blueprint for its healing. She never asked to be the face of justice. She only asked that someone carry it forward when she was done speaking. And now they were. Across offices, across parties, across the tired aisles of division, people were beginning to remember what justice was supposed to feel like. Not punishment, not revenge, but restoration, dignity, truth made whole again. And maybe, just maybe, that's what justice really looks like. Not as a verdict, but as a mirror. One that reflects who we are, who we've failed, and who we still have the power to become. The crowd outside the Capitol didn't chant. They didn't carry megaphones or banners. They stood in quiet rows, some holding candles, some holding nothing but their breath, as the sun dipped behind the marble dome that had witnessed both injustice and its unraveling. In the center stood a small podium, unadorned. No flags, no slogans. Only the bear, Mariana's bear, now sealed in glass, resting where the whole nation could see it. Jasmine Crockett didn't return to the spotlight. She didn't need to. Her words had already been etched into 1,000 walls, 1,000,000 screens, and the quiet decisions of people who finally understood that neutrality was no longer a shield. The movement had passed through her and kept going. That was always the point. A young girl stepped forward, no more than 8 years old. Her mother whispered something into her ear. She walked to the podium, placed a single white flower beside the glass case, and looked up, not at a politician, but at a symbol that told her someone had cared enough to fight for a child like her. That image would be remembered far longer than any voter verdict, because it was simple, it was human. It was proof that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, not today. Not today to silence. Not today to indifference. Not today to policies that bury children behind acronyms and bureaucracy. Not today to systems that wear legality like armor to avoid accountability. Jasmine Crockett never needed to shout to be heard. She only needed one folder, one bear, and one truth. And she delivered all three with the calm force of someone who refused to let cruelty call itself law. And so the country watched, not because they were told to, but because they couldn't look away. Because deep down, they recognized the power of one voice refusing to vanish into the noise. And when that voice said, not today, the world finally listened. And in that stillness, after the crowd had dispersed, after the cameras dimmed, after history quietly turned its page, what remained was not just the barren glass or the sentence heard around the world. What remained was a deeper knowing that justice does not arrive in the hands of the powerful. It rises through the voices of the unheard. That courage is not volume. It's persistence. It's choosing to stand when no one asks you to. It's speaking when the room was built to ignore you. Jasmine Crockett did not shift the world by force. She shifted it by refusing to look away. And in doing so, she reminded us of the truth we forget most often, that a system is only as human as the people who hold it accountable. We like to believe injustice is loud, that it storms through gates and shouts its name. But most days it walks in quietly, dressed in protocol, speaking in policy, and hiding behind what is legal. That's why stories like Mariana's matter. That's why silence in the face of clarity is no longer innocence. It is endorsement. And if we claim to care, if we dare to say we are better than the pain we permit, then we must become louder than the systems we've allowed to speak for us. Because justice does not begin in courtrooms. It begins the moment someone chooses to say, not in my name, not on my watch, not today. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.